Our Old Testament text today is from the book of Joshua, very last chapter, chapter 24, beginning at verse 1. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors, Terah and his sons, Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in its midst. And afterwards I brought you out. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your ancestors with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. When they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did to Egypt. Afterwards you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites, who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I handed them over to you, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then King Balak, son of Zippor of Moab, set out to fight against Israel. He sent and invited Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam before he blessed you. Therefore he blessed you. So I rescued you out of his hand. When you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And I handed them over to you. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove out before you 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and towns that you had not built, and you live in them. You eat the fruits of the vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant. Now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods of your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Can't get there from here. Anyone who's ever lived in New England, and most everyone who has traveled there, has heard this. It's said in a down east accent. That was my best shot at a down east accent. And it's meant to evoke a grizzled, salt-wrinkled guy in waders who's just stepped off his trawler. And he's trying to help hapless travelers who are utterly flummoxed by the Maine coast. Can't get there from here. Have you ever said that to yourself? Maybe you really were on an actual road with a co-pilot trying diligently to read and interpret an incredibly confusing map to no avail. Lost. This may only apply to those of us over a certain age. Or maybe you were depending on your brand new GPS, one you'd even affectionately given a name, Greta, Greta Garman. And instead of leading you to the cool restaurant/brewery down by the outlet mall, she led you to a dark, dark hill in the middle of the woods, in the middle of Nowheresville, Pennsylvania. This may apply to family members of people in the pulpit. Or maybe your GPS was of a different kind, the internal kind, the inner voice that said, sure, you should definitely try out for the team, try to get into this graduate program, apply for the job, ask that girl out. And it became evident over time, eventually, or maybe sooner than that you had somehow been misdirected, that this plan, this road, this map was not going to work out at all. Can't get there from here. For some of us, these kinds of things are distant memories, even fond ones, memories we draw upon in conversations over coffee that stop. You wouldn't believe what I used to. Memories shared from the perspective of the good land of plenty in which we are now planted and flourishing. For some of us, these are not memories at all, but they are the present vortex, the crucible in which we live, study, work, toss and turn all night long, so that the next day of living, studying, and working is made all the more dreary and long. For some of us, we are living, can't get there from here right now, and it's awful, just awful. Allow me to introduce you to one Joshua. Joshua, whose name in Hebrew means Yahweh is salvation. Joshua, who took over for Moses once it was clear that Moses personally was not destined to cross that toll bridge that led from the desert wastes into the land of promise. And before Joshua, there was Moses, who heard the voice of God in the middle of a desert wasteland, speaking to him from a burning bush, and who, as a result, worked alongside God to lead God's people out of slavery in Egypt into freedom, and also 40 years of wandering in a desert wasteland. And before Moses, there was Joseph, the hated second-to-youngest son of Jacob, whose brothers were so jealous of him, they turned him into a kind of gone boy, selling him into slavery, telling their father he was dead. Joseph, who worked alongside God as second in command in Egypt, to make a home, to provide food, not just for Egyptians, but for his own remorseful, traveling, long-lost family. And before Joseph, there were Abraham and Sarah, called at ages 75 and 65 to uproot themselves, to leave home, family, and gods behind, to follow and enter into a new covenant with a new God, the God Yahweh, who promised them children and land and blessing. And before Abraham and Sarah, there was Noah, called at the age of 600 for God's sake, to craft an ark, to save a faithful remnant for God's sake from the destruction of the floodwaters, to help that remnant to pass through the waters to a new beginning. At each stage of this story, the story of God's people, which also happens to be our story, at each and every stage, any one of these people could have said, must have thought, had to have believed. Can't get there from here. Can't become a mother at age 65 plus, never mind moving all around to God only knows where. Can't go from being a hated boy sold into slavery to being the second highest ranking official in a country not even your own. Can't single-handedly walk into Egypt, where, by the way, you're wanted for murder, and say to the Pharaoh, let my people go, and expect him to take you seriously. Can't get there from here. There is an African-American folk saying, our God can make a way out of no way. And that means if you are a slave in Egypt or a slave in Montgomery, and you are longing for freedom, God can make that happen. God can make a way, even if it seems there is no way. This is the gist of the long speech Joshua has just made to the people of Israel. He goes through their salvation history, not backwards like I did. He went forwards. And he reminds the people, God did this, and this, and this. And all that time, we were thinking it could not be done. Who could save an entire sampling of God's creative powers on a single boat? Noah, with God's help. Who could go from being a small family consisting of one childless retirement-age couple to being a great nation? Abraham and Sarah, with God's help. Who could climb out of the hole of hatred and find not only power but integrity, faithfulness, forgiveness? Joseph, with God's help. Who could speak for a group of slaves and be heard? Moses, with God's help. In each and every instance, the strong temptation is to say, no way. There is no way. We cannot get to that promised land of safety, of fullness, of reconciliation, of freedom. We can't get there from here. And yet, so the story goes. Joshua recounts all the history of God's people, and he includes a less savory part, a more problematic part for many of us, the part often known as the conquest of the land. And it amounts to some serious chest thumping. We beat those guys, and we beat those guys, and we annihilated those other guys. And look, we are the champions, my friends. And we'll keep on fighting to the end. We are the champions. We are the champions. No time for losers, because we are the champions of the world. And they are. And yet, in a fashion decidedly atypical for the commander of a conquering army, Joshua takes great care to say, we didn't do this, God did it. And if we look at our passage, we see all kinds of signs that while there was violent conflict, there was also some measure of restraint, some effort to frame God's victories differently. God, speaking through Joshua, says, it was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land in which you had not labored, and towns that you had not built. And you live in them, and you eat the fruit of the vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant. This is tricky terrain. I walk upon it and invite you to walk with me with tremendous trepidation. Here we are with a part of the story that makes us wonder how we are to connect with it and how we are to live into it. And it makes sense as Joshua asks us to consider in his speech, his last speech, by the way, his deathbed speech, who will we serve? Joshua, his name in Hebrew means Yahweh is salvation. Do you know how to say Joshua in Greek? Any guesses? Jesus. Jesus and Joshua. Their names mean God is salvation. God saves. God makes a way where there is no way. God even makes a way through a sticky, prickly, thorny passage like this, which simultaneously asks us to accept a story in which God's people claim their right to a land with no concern for its native inhabitants, and also to serve a God whom we claim to see reflected in Jesus of Nazareth. Can we get there from here? Can God make a way from stories of conquest to the stories of the table we find in our accounts of the New Testament Joshua, son of Joseph? Can God make a way for us to find in this little snippet of God's story some continuity with the God who is pleased, as Paul tells us in that first reading, when we persevere in suffering and open our doors to strangers? Can God make a way for those of us who feel we can't get there from here, whatever we might mean by that? God not only can, God does. As for me and my household, ours is not to ignore these passages or to try to wish them away or pray them away or pretend them away. Ours is to read them with empathy. Empathy for the fervent hopes of a people who had traveled those desert wastes for many, many years. Empathy for their fear that all of God's promises might come to nothing. Empathy even for the dying warrior, Joshua, a human man who has spent his whole life way out on a limb. A man whose bones probably needed to be in the ground before a new day could dawn in which a new set of ears could listen for the words of Yahweh. A man who is but one in a great cloud of witnesses who listen and discern what are God's desires and dreams for God's people in a new day, today. And even some empathy for ourselves as we claim these stories as our own, and even as we struggle to recognize ourselves in them. These are our stories. We are in there. We are the tired ones. We are the frightened ones. We are the ones who wander through stages and years and false starts and the wrong job and the wrong major until we figure it out. We figure out where we're meant to be. We are the ones who wonder, can we get there, whether our personal land of promise might be, wherever it might be? Can we get there from here? We're the ones to whom God makes the promise, I will make a way for you. I will make a way with you. We are the ones who call Jesus the way. We're the ones who are asked, even today, who will you serve? And we're the ones, thanks be to God, who are privileged to have a moment, an opportunity to take a deep breath and give our answer. Thanks be to God. Amen.